for all sorts of aspects of big data science, including how do we choose the expertise of the people who are fabricating and developing the systems, and how do we develop and specify data infrastructures, and particularly what do we think is an essential knowledge base for data dissemination and reuse, and how do we think about governance in this situation. So one of the lessons learned from thinking through these problems is the fact that having curation of data which is context specific is, I mean, we've seen it in every single case we looked at, absolutely crucial for adequate scientific reuse and robust scientific reuse, and yet is very badly underestimated within the scientific system at this point. And so, of course, this is very problematic because trying to bring together contemporary data science and data curation with long-held methods for thinking about the validation of data is absolutely crucial. Here again, I think that a place like Cidacs is doing really fantastic work, and particularly also because there's a big question around what does it mean also in terms of remaining user-friendly. We've seen many, many cases in the history of data science and big data, which goes back several centuries, actually, of data infrastructures that failed dramatically, no matter how many experts and how much money was put into those, because they didn't take into account of what users, in fact, would do with these wonderful resources. So here's definitely a lesson learned. And one of the things that, again, we saw very clearly is that systems that decided to allow for many different methods and many different approaches to data, different ways of visualizing them, different ways of considering what the relevant data would be, were vastly preferable to systems that narrowed down those choices to just one. Right? Partly because of the multiplicity of reuse situations where many users want to have a sense of what are the alternatives, what are the different ways in which I could visualize this, what are the different types of data sets I could use here, how do I think about different variables given my research. And so, related to this, one of the things which I think is now being taken up certainly within the European data infrastructure is a very important point now, is that rather than thinking about systems that integrate data without allowing you to, in fact, disaggregate those clusters if you need to, there's a very strong push to provide systems that allow you to link data with each other, but also unlink them whenever needed, so that you actually can think about these systems in a much more modular way than a sort of linear trajectory from lots of different data here, now we make them more cluster-like, more cluster-like, here we have just one cluster, we can now forget everything that happened before. I mean, that doesn't really seem to work, and certainly not for research epidemiology, biomedicine, biology. I mean, this is where very often you need to know something about the history of that data to be able to understand what is going on in the cluster that you're actually dealing with. So of course standardization is very important, but there is a balance between standardizing too much, potentially, and using system-specific knowledge that is very important to keep in mind. And of course, one of the things that we've seen, and we keep seeing, and I'm sure you've seen all the time, is that the whole landscape, the ecosystem of data infrastructures is extremely confusing, because it's very non-transparent, even to people who are in it, right? It's very difficult, like databases have very different kinds of funding, different longevity, different ways of being updated, and some of them not being updated. And so it's very difficult when you enter the landscape from whichever point to understand what exactly is going on, how do I calibrate these different data sources with each other, how do I move in this environment. And of course, particularly problematic is the fact that very often you don't know when a particular data source or database is not being maintained anymore. It could still be online, it could still be accessible, but actually nobody's really kind of making sure that the system is up to date, nobody's making sure that the data is actually still reliable as time goes by, and that creates a lot of unevenness in the data landscape, which is potentially really problematic. So, I mean, this is one potential way to think about this difficult nesting problem of different data infrastructures. We have lots of different types of data type that go into these structures which have some levels of overlap, sometimes they don't overlap, sometimes they prevent different things, and people that go in as users don't quite see the architecture very typically, so it's really not easy to reconstruct, which creates potentially issues in terms of the reliability of the inferences. So the second lesson learned here is that the longevity of this kind of structure is absolutely crucial to the trustworthiness. You don't want to have something as a researcher that is going to disappear within 5 years. You also don't want to have something where you're not really sure whether or not there are people actually taking care and stewarding the data and the data linkage tools that you would like to use in your research. So, I mean, of course, this becomes particularly difficult when you're in a very complex international field where the interdependencies between structures over which you don't really have any control in terms of who's going to be funded in the future, what's going to happen to them, becomes complex. And we've seen a few cases of, one database failing, but that creating ripples all over a whole ecosystem of data infrastructures because suddenly the data that you thought you could just depend on is just not there anymore, so the pipelines start to get disrupted. Now, there's also, I think, a lot of trouble with data sources that we're seeing at this point, which we also think is relatively worrying in terms of how does one think about the big data landscape. I already said, data curation, dissemination doesn't tend to be rewarded very well within the scientific system, but that, of course, creates a problem of supply. So we talk about the fact that there's lots of data everywhere, but in fact, in the research environment, there's relatively little data available compared to what is actually being produced. And not only that, but there's a huge skew in the kind of data that you in fact find. So typically, the data that you would find very often is data which are produced by relatively powerful, very visible research locations who have the facility to actually disseminate that data. And that, in fact, it creates even more inequality in the science system between people who actually have the resources to participate in this whole wonderful work of doing big data and reusing them, and people actually don't have those facilities. And there's also a question around, how comprehensive databases are, how usable they are, how reliable they are, which again, the problem here is that we always, in science, always had a situation where data were coming from very particular perspectives, there are all sorts of limitations. But in these big data ecosystems, very often we just lose those qualifications. It becomes much more difficult to access them. And so again, it becomes more difficult to understand to which extent these data actually are reliable. So again, kind of intermediaries that are really experts in data become even more important to help researchers to make those choices. And of course, there's lots of problems around the quality of data that's being disseminated and the way in which the solutions are being proposed, particularly IT algorithms, which look very exciting, but to which extent do these things align to the needs of people who are actually working on the ground in research is still another question. Okay. So, one of the lessons learned here is, well, there actually are constant and substantive disagreements among people even working in the same laboratory, the same resource that we've documented about what in fact counts as data. It is certainly what counts as good data. And, what methods should be used, what terminology, what standards should be involved in the management, production, and interpretation. And in fact, in my philosophical work, I've been working on trying to think about a definition of data that gives you a sense that actually, data is a relational object. These are not objects which have, a truth value which is independent of the context. And of course, that flies in the face of some of the legends about what we mean when we think about induction and empiricism, right? But these are objects that in fact change their meaning depending on where you put them and in which context you consider them, which in fact is one of the main reasons why mobilizing data is so scientifically important, because if you change the context and the perspective in which you're actually seeing the data will actually potentially tell you something different and be used at what we call different evidential value. I'm not going to spend too much on this, but we can come back to this. So, in the ways in which we've been thinking about data, in fact, any object could be considered to be a datum, doesn't matter whether it's a number or not, whether it's an object of different types, as long as it's treated as potential evidence for one or more claims about phenomena, and it's actually possible to circulate it among individuals or groups or kind of, in a physical sense. So it's a relational framework in which the same object may or may not be functioning as data, depending on the situation of inquiry in which they're put, which has all sorts of interesting implications when one thinks about, what are our obligations with respect to the objects we have in front of us. We've documented lots of cases. For instance, the case of microarray in biological biomedical research is an interesting one. These are data that a lot of people working in biomedicine and clinical environments see as highly standardized and highly reliable because they're produced by very standardized machines, like which are available all over the world. People in biology very often would see these kind of data are utterly unreliable because their production and the results depend so much on the laboratory environment in which you actually are doing that kind of data production. And these kind of disagreements don't really get discussed. And so you get very, very different ideas about what counts as good data being put into the same database potentially, which has interesting implications. And of course, one of the things also we've seen is that things like the models you're using for the data, the standards, and the different materials from which you're taking the data are very important in trying to understand how you should reuse data, how you should share them. And one of the things that we observed is that, I mean, as I said before, the reuse of data, the extent to which data put online was actually being reused, was very often dependent on people having some hand, if you want, or some participation or engagement in developing data infrastructures in the first place. Which I think is why yesterday we had a little discussion about to which extent, for instance, Cidacs work could open itself up to have more of the different stakeholders of the work coming into this working patterns a bit earlier than when you've actually finished a project, to try and think about how to involve people more and therefore actually secure more expansive reuse and more uptake. And again, there is this constant problem of having very big difficulties in not only following the history of data, but also both these other components like models, software, materials that accompany the data as they're traveling around. And so one of the lessons learned here is what happens, for instance, in the case of materials, but also models and management. Now, one of the kind of interesting questions also that all of this raises